Thank you everyone for coming here, and thank you to the Map Society for hosting this event. It is kind of the culmination of a big undertaking that I started in 2019. And this project took 2 years to complete. And I'm just happy to share it with everyone because there was a time after this drawing was done, I reached out to a few different publishers and I didn't get very favorable responses. So there was a time where I thought maybe this drawing wouldn't see the light of day. It wouldn't be published or exhibited anywhere. So it's been a long time, and I'm just thrilled to have this book finally be published and finally be available for everyone to enjoy. And so I hope each of you will enjoy hearing about its creation tonight. And again, thank you for coming out. I know there's so many places you could be tonight, but you've decided to share it with me and learn about this drawing. So I really appreciate it. And David, thank you also for your hospitality. David and I met about, it feels like a year ago, planning this event. And so it's to finally be the day that it happens. The first public presentation of this is really special for me. So thank you. So I'll just dive right into it. My name, Ryan Chester. I'm an architect here in Chicago. I was born and raised in Milwaukee. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Architecture. So I'm Midwestern, local, always loved Chicago. It was always my place of dreams when I was growing up, the place I always wanted to live. And I'm so happy to live here and be a part of the Chicago story and contribute to it. If I can figure out the technology. This is interesting. David, would you happen to know advancing the slides?
Yeah, I think it might be on. That might be like
Sleeping.
Zoom. No, the Zoom app rather than.
Oh. What is that? You just hit this?
Yeah, because it should. Yeah, we're just. It was in the Zoom program.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So this is the book. You're probably all aware. Chicago Reflected. It's really a fold-out, miniaturized version of the original drawing that I did. The original drawing is on a single piece of paper. It's 55 feet long. So the boards are actually even reduced from the original drawing itself. It's been condensed into a much smaller format and folded out on the table here as an example of the book, which is available for sale here. And it's only about 11 feet long. So it's about a quarter the size of the original drawing. And I would like to thank, I don't know if anybody from the University of Chicago Press is here tonight. I don't think so. There's a team that has helped me navigate this publishing process, and they've done an incredible job. I have only met one of them, Tim Mennel, who is the one that I've been primarily working with, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him. He took a chance on me. It doesn't come easily to make a book that has this unique case and format. It's very unusual. So there's a little bit of risk involved, and he took it on, and I appreciate everybody over at the press for making it happen. A little bit more about me. Like I mentioned, born and raised in Milwaukee. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Architecture and Urban Planning, both for my undergrad and graduate studies. Upon graduating, I moved to New York for about 2 years before then having an opportunity to work in London, where I worked at several firms before coming back to the Midwest in 2011, and I've been here ever since. Currently working at JGMA, and several of my colleagues are in the audience today, so thank you for supporting me. And I'm also now teaching a little bit as an adjunct professor in Milwaukee as well. So that's my background. I've been kind of out and back from the Midwest, and within this time, past 3 years, really, a lot of my focus has been on, of course, work itself, but then these extra projects where I can find some extra joy. I've been drawing a very, very long time. So this drawing was drawn when I was either 11 or 12 years old. And so I've been into this for a while. And actually, you can see on the lower right-hand corner, that's the Milwaukee River. So in a way, it's full circle here, looking at cities from the river. Back in the early 90s, I would have been 6th or 7th grade, the internet wasn't really a thing, at least not the way it is today. So we had encyclopedias, and many of you probably remember that.
Still own one.
Yeah, I haven't seen one in quite a while, but
Well, the history hasn't changed that much, maybe the interpretation, the people who were dead then are still there.
that's true. So I would open up in my time at 6th or 7th grade, open up an encyclopedia, find a picture I like, and draw from that. So this was probably drawn in my classroom in my 7th, 6th grade class. And so this is the oldest drawing I still have in my possession. And so I just like to show it because it tells the story about where I've come from in Milwaukee, the suburbs of Milwaukee, and relating it full circle back to what I've done in this project. Again, I work at JGMA and I have a great opportunity to draw almost every day. Sometimes I feel guilty about how much I get to enjoy my work and how much I get to draw at it. This is actually a series of drawings that are posted next to my desk. Once a week, we try to post an image to social media from our archive. So most of these projects are unrealized, unbuilt work. And some of them are built, but primarily from the archives of unbuilt projects. And it's a way to kind of celebrate the history and legacy of our firm, even though some of them might not have been built. A lot of time, effort, and creativity has gone into these projects. And so I'm grateful to be able to kind of celebrate that in the office and through social media.
Those actual projects, are those just perspectives for projects?
They were primarily projects, like there would be a rendering and I would draw of the rendering, so it was not built.
Okay.
Some of them were, but most of them have not been built. On the opposite wall on my desk, you can see the desk there on the lower left-hand corner is all of these images are conceptual sketches of projects in the office right now. So whether it's a kind of rendered view or a detail, you could see a lot of different types of drawings on the wall here. So that's my process of working through the design and constructability of a project. And so again, both sides of the wall on either side of my desk, one is the unrealized or perspective view, and the other one is the kind of messy process of how a building gets developed. And so you can see here in my daily architectural career, I try as much as I can to use my hand drawing as much as possible because it's what I'm very passionate about. So like I mentioned, I went to school, graduated in 2005. I started traveling internationally since around late 90s, early 2000. And up until the last few years, maybe until 2017, I only really drew from life when I would travel internationally. So I lived in London for a while, did a lot of drawing there, but I never really looked at Chicago. Even though I lived here for a number of years, I didn't really, for some reason, it didn't come across my radar as something that I would be focused on, maybe because it was all around me and I didn't feel the need to represent it. But then around 2017, a group of very young architects joined the office I was working at the time, and they started something called the Sketch Club, where at lunchtime, once a week, we would go into the city and draw. And we would just have that 1 hour to draw, and that was it. So I thought, this is an incredible idea. I wanted to participate in it. And so the very first drawing I did in 2017 in the summer is the lower right, the Wrigley building, which is where my office was at the time. And every single week since that day, no matter what, unless I'm out of the country and drawing from those international locations or on vacation somewhere else, I draw every week and I post to social media. So this is kind of like my repository ever since 2017, and that young group of architects that started that sketch club, I've actually acknowledged in Chicago Reflected, because I always appreciate that they, in a way, opened my eyes to drawing Chicago. Often in the wintertime, going outside, not an option. So I didn't want my drawing to stop. So these are some good examples of drawing out of the window of the Wrigley building when it's cold. So there was 1 or 2 seasons. The Wrigley building obviously has great views on nearly every side. So I tried my best to document views in different styles. looking down on the Apple store from over Michigan Avenue. I often had to pull up a chair in weird places and hope nobody thought it was unusual. Or looking down at one of the bridge houses on Michigan Avenue. Or more recently at my wife's office, who's also an architect. This is just a few weeks ago from her 30th floor office in the Prudential building. So near Michigan Avenue. So in 2019, must have been January or something, there's a Ghirardelli on Michigan Avenue in the Wrigley building. And I thought maybe I could use 3 of my weeks by drawing out each one of the windows, just creating a series. So first one looking over Michigan Avenue. These are all looking south towards Wacker Drive. The second one, part 2 of 3, and then the third. So there's absolutely nothing really special about these drawings. But when you put them together, it starts to build on something. So that's 1 hour times 3 over 3 weeks. And after I drew this, I started thinking, if I can spend 3 hours over my lunch relaxing, drawing this, I should be able to do something pretty special if I commit a whole 6 months of cold weather. And that got me thinking about another project someone else had done, where you take the entire length of a river or a waterfront and document it. And so this is actually the first map that I looked at considering what ended up being Chicago reflected. So going from the lake near Lakeshore Drive, looking at the south side of the river, making the bend towards the south branch, all the way down to Bertrand Goldberg's River City on the south. I just wanted this to do this as a personal challenge. Could it be done? Would I have the enthusiasm to do it? And so I started working. And the idea was every week in a big scroll that's 100 feet long, bond paper, terrible quality, but it was the only type of paper I could get at this size. It's the kind of paper you would normally print plots. So not like quality paper. It's not meant to last forever. It's just print paper that eventually gets thrown out. And that's another story and challenge of the project. But the idea is 1 foot. So Chicago is a very, very gridded city. And the idea is 1 week, I would draw 1 foot, which means one bridge to another bridge. And all I had to do was open up a scroll, draw for 1 foot, pencil line, and then go to the next week and continue the drawing. So I never actually saw the whole thing until it was done. And even now, it's really hard to look at it in one piece just because it's so big. I did not come up with this idea. It has been done. And as far as I know, the person that was responsible and inspired me to do this is Matteo Pericoli. In 2001, he published Manhattan Unfurled, which is a very similar concept, almost exactly the same in terms of the presentation of this book. And so in 2001, this was published. It's really a single drawing all the way around the island of Manhattan. I could never find out from him or anywhere else how long the original drawing is. He's done other books similar to this in London, up and down the Thames. And I've seen a video of that, and I believe it's smaller than mine, primarily because the buildings are much smaller, shorter. And so I don't know how long Manhattan Unfurled is, but I get the feeling it might be smaller in length. I've contacted Matteo a number of times just to tell him this is coming, and I've tried to get more information out of him, but he's kind of a quiet guy. He now lives in Turin, Italy. He used to live as an architect also in Manhattan. So this is an example of his project. The image on the left, Lower Manhattan 2001. This book was actually published right before 9/11. So this book came out. I have a copy of it, and I really appreciated what he did. And then 10 years later, the New Yorker magazine asked him to do the image on the right, which was what the exact same view would look like 10 years later. So World Trade Center is still under construction in that view. And at first I thought, oh, he probably just did a patch and added the new buildings, but in fact, he redrew it. So I'll get back to this again. This is kind of an inspirational image for me too, because I have ideas of Chicago reflected, if it ever becomes a second edition, there will be plenty of other buildings to add. Because even in the 2 or 3 years since I finished drawing, a lot of new buildings have already gone up along the river. So this is very small, but it gives you an idea of the extent of both sides of the river, both north, south, east, west. The main south side of the river, main branch, and east, that's the drawing on the top from 2020. I actually started this drawing in 2019, before the pandemic began. I spent 6 months drawing the top image, ending in April. So I really only wanted to work on this during the winter because in the summer I'm out drawing the city in person, not from photographs. Then after the summer ended in 2020, beginning in November, I went back and decided to do the other side. And so then another 6 months, 24 weeks roughly, ending in 2021. So the drawing was done 6 months, 6 months break, and then another 6 months, ending in April of 2021. I made assumptions during the first 6 months, that 1 foot per week idea. Thought it was a great idea when I started. Turns out it kind of ruined something for me, and I'll get into that. And so I changed the way I did the second half, the bottom image of the west and north side of the river. So I can just get into some of the highlights for you. You can see where I came from, things I was thinking of, and things that I learned as I went. First of all, I'm not a structural engineer. The first point here, I'm an architect. I don't know exactly what a lot of this stuff looks like, especially when you're cutting through bridges that are not visible to everyone all the time. And so if you look closely at the drawing, you can sometimes see rivets, bolts, beams, bracing, all of the stuff that an engineer might look at and be like, what are you, crazy? That doesn't work. Well, I gave it a good shot. One of my criticisms of Matteo Pericoli's book was all of the great suspension bridges that are crossing the Hudson or the East River. His bridges actually come out of the page, but then they kind of dissipate. They don't resolve themselves. They don't get chopped. They don't fall to an edge somewhere on the drawing. They kind of bleed. And I kind of wanted to do the opposite. Instead of having them bleed, I wanted to contain them and cut them in section. It's architecturally saying, cut it in half and see the guts. And so I tried my best to show the complexities of the structure within each bridge. And there are 20 or 30 bridges that are cut in this way. Each of them are slightly different. As I mentioned earlier, new construction, there's quite a bit of it. When I drew this, that Cirrus was built in 2022. So by the time I finished, that building was still under construction, but today it's done. And so that's one of the 6 examples of buildings that I would like to add if I ever did another edition or something beyond what's in the book today. The St. Regis was also not complete when I drew it. And an interesting story here is because I started planning this drawing 1 foot sections per week, I have a limited amount of paper space in height. And I didn't plan on how tall that building actually is. So this image on screen is what's in the book, but the actual drawing is the one on the left. So you can see it looks a little stubby, which is to say if the drawing is ever displayed in its original state, it would look like the one on the left. And the building wasn't even done yet. So there's actually a lattice. Let me just, this is the story. The building wasn't done yet. So I looked at renderings and there's this kind of facade, and you see the 2 places where that exists. After I realized what had happened, I went back at the end as this was about to get published and did this patch. So, I just redrew it in its proper dimension and then scanned it and placed it on the drawing. And you can see that the final design or the final build condition of this building doesn't have that lattice in 2 places. It's only 1. And so I kind of updated the drawing to make it more like it was actually built rather than the original design. So that was my lesson. When I did the opposite side of the river, I did not do this 1 foot between bridges because Trump Tower is the tallest on that side. And I made sure that would fit and I wouldn't have to patch it after I drew it. I tried to include as many boats as I could. I mean, without going crazy, I tried to include as many as I could find that actually regularly cruise along the river. When I first went to the CAC, the Chicago Architecture Center, I rolled out the drawing, and when I was done presenting it, they said, okay, you showed 5 of our boats and 7 of our competitors' boats. I don't think that, I just thought that was a funny comment. That was the first thing they said, like counting boats as I was doing this.
You don't have any kayaks either.
I do.
You
I'll get to it. So another building, 300 North Michigan Avenue, BTL 2022. In a way, I'm happy that building wasn't part of my drawing because right behind it is the Carbide and Carbon building, which is very unique. And the building that would be covering up is not so unique. So in a way, I'm happy that I made that one stick. By the time I got over to the Kemper building, you can see highlighted there, I made another realization because up until I got to that building, I was actually placing signs on buildings. So the Swiss Hotel has a sign, the CAC has a big C. The London House, if you look super carefully, has a sign. And by the time I got to the Kemper building, which surprisingly, that sign is now gone, I realized in that location, there are other signs, and I didn't want to draw those signs. So I decided to not draw them anymore. There's a controversial sign on the other side of the river.
You know which one.
So another weird thing is when I was drawing this, I'm drawing in perspective, meaning most every building, or you could see 2 sides. There's a primary facade along the river and then a smaller facade that's kind of in perspective. And so an interesting thing about the drawing is it's a fantasy. There's no way you could possibly draw or take photographs of this and get the same impression. And a good example is here. Between these 2 streets, LaSalle and Franklin, as you would normally look at a photograph, as you go further away from your point of view, those buildings should get closer together. But because I've stretched this whole thing apart and pushed all the facades of the buildings back, in order to get this reading to work, I had to say, all right, I can't put these 2 buildings together. They have to be spread apart. So a keen eye would say, wait a minute, these buildings look like they're 4 blocks apart from each other, but they're actually right across the street from each other. So I find this to be interesting, and maybe many of you haven't noticed that, but now you can see I had to distort reality in order to get this thing to work. Another thing is, you can see here in this image, a lot of the bridges start changing orientation. So in this case, on the left, the bridges are coming out of the Thames River and from the bottom to the top towards the right, and then they start changing. Every bridge is kind of changing its angle just a little bit. And the idea there was, I knew I would come to the curve of the river. And so I was trying to play an illusion by saying, okay, when I get to this curve, I can't curve the paper. So I'm going to try to make the buildings artificially get taller and then curve and then kind of fade back down. So you get this illusion of kind of something coming towards you. And the bridges were also supposed to do that. So as you go from Dearborn, Clark, LaSalle, Franklin, and suddenly you get to the river's edge, this bridge ruined me because Franklin is the only bridge that isn't on the Chicago grid. And so normally I would want both bridges to come out in perspective to kind of open up and not block 333 Wacker Drive, but Franklin ruined me because it's on a weird perspective. And the illusion is there, but you can see that that bridge looks a little tipsy, but it's because it's on an angle and that's the way I had to represent it.
And you decided to have all the operable bridges in the open position?
So they're supposed to look like they're just coming out towards you. And you'll see an example of open bridges coming. So these are supposed to look like they're just coming out, and I've cut them. As we make the bend down, now we're going on the south side of the river, still looking towards the east. The Bank of America Tower by Getch 2020 was just about nearing completion, but I thought it would look more interesting under construction. That tower crane wasn't actually there when I took the picture. I think it looks more cool under construction. So here you can actually see, now you see the bridges as you get towards the right, that one's lifted, there are sailboats underneath it. So then you can really see that it's up. So the bridges are kind of moving up, up, up until you get to that point where the sailboats are. Oh, and by the way, the Civic Opera House, that is where COVID hit. This drawing was at my office in the Wrigley Building until that building. And I remember having to bring the drawing, this big scroll home all the way. And from that point, everything was done at my house because I couldn't draw it in the office anymore. So obviously the Willis or the Sears Tower is the tallest building in the city, but thanks to my perspective, it didn't pose as big of a problem as the Vista Tower did because I artificially decreased its height because it's 1 block away from the river. So because everything is vanishing and that building theoretically would be getting shorter because it's not as close to the viewer as some of the other buildings are. Here, the city kind of takes a dip in its height because at the Eisenhower, there's quite a bit less development. And then the final stretch of that first 6 months was here as we round out the southern end at River City. And 2 Perkins and Will buildings. I actually worked on the Cooper, that one that's highlighted, which was built in 2019. So that's the only building that I've had a lot of work on as an architect, that one. So at the end of this 6 months, which one do I have to? At the end of that 6 months, I had no intention of publishing. I just thought, okay, that was fun, done. You can put it away. And I spent 6 months, still COVID, still mainly at home, but drawing around the neighborhood. And then I realized November rolled around and I thought, okay, I should really do the other side because it's incomplete. I only did half of the central portion of the city. So now I looked at that same map and realized, all right, this is going to be a little bit longer, but I'm not going to make the same mistake by going 1 block is 1 foot. And so I changed my process and decided, all right, the tallest building is going to determine how much height I have, which then proportionally would tell me how wide between each bridge. And so there are the kayakers, the only people on the entire drawing. There's the old post office. And this side of the river isn't quite as monumental as the opposite side. And I've always been fascinated with Union Station, which you see there, that little temple-like building, it's a classical building, is actually doesn't exist. I drew it, yes. The 2 buildings that exist there now is a faceless white stone or concrete building that's like 30 floors, and then another black box that has X-bracing exposed. I can't imagine losing something like that and having to draw those 2 because there would not be fun to draw, and they would also cover up the concourse building. I'm sorry, the head house behind it. Thank you. And so this way I'm able to show both. And I just had to not draw those 2 other buildings.
Well, I like that. I remember when they tore that building down. They actually caught a train in 1969. It was torn down. Of course, it was very difficult for them to demolish it.
Because it was quality. They should tear down the others and rebuild it, don't you think? So here we're going back. Now here, as you think about it, you're coming full circle. Those are the sailboats that you saw on the opposite side. So the bridges are going up again. That's the same spot that they were in the opposite side of the drawing. Sailboats, yep. The L, so both Lake Street and Wells have trains that run across them. In both cases, I drew the train as though it's about to head over the bridge. But again, it's cut. So I just wanted to draw the train because it's a unique condition.
It's just L, it's not EL. EL is in New York. And they don't have much in the L.
No, don't.
The L.
Oh, you're ruining the presentation.
I'm sorry.
Thank you for telling.
Poetic license, other people make that. The reader's not. Forget it.
Okay, so here the opposite is true. On the other side of the river, 333 Wacker Drive is this big imposing facade that creates the bend in the river. Here, the opposite, the North Branch splits at Wolf Point. And so here I'm trying to show those buildings kind of dissipating in scale before you wrap around Wolf Point. So in a way, I'm trying to show that these two buildings here are moving away from your eye, and then as you turn the corner, you come to Wolf Point, and you have a new the north side of the main branch. And you can see the Salesforce Tower, when I took photos, was simply a crane. And today, that building is totally occupied. And that would be another one of those examples that I would love to bring back into a drawing. The Reed Murdoch building in 1914 is the oldest building on the drawing, and coincidentally stands in front of where the Eastland happened in 1 year later. And so I drew it as though this is, I mean, an incredible ship that took so many lives, and everybody should know about this. I know. And they lay a wreath on the river every year on the anniversary of that, and I think it would be a shame if I ignored it. So to see a ship like that, it's even hard for me to fit it on the drawing and give it justice because it was so large. Again, the tallest tower directly on the river, if you count the spire, on top of Trump Tower, that's the building that I had to make sure fit, so I didn't make the same mistake twice. The iconic view looking north on Michigan Avenue, and then the Centennial Fountain, which is, I think, not working right now. So it's working in my drawing, so look at that, aren't we lucky? Navy Pier, and then here, as we get towards the lake, the lock, and the open position right in front of the towers at the edge of Navy Pier. You can see in the foreground, the boats are cruising into the lock there. And then on the opposite side, I tried to show the lock closed, kind of coming at you, so that it has a kind of dual system. I don't know exactly how I don't remember how I figured out what this thing looks like in section, but again, making assumptions, trying to get things to look believable. So if you're not an expert or haven't been there, you'd probably believe it. And then finally, the way I ended the drawing was this big tall ship, which is the Dennis Sullivan, which was commissioned by Discovery World Museum in Milwaukee. It spent its summers in Milwaukee as a kind of living museum, and it would spend its winters in the Caribbean. And then when yeah, that's right. I checked to see how it was spelled, just to make sure I didn't mess up like I did with the L. And I was like, okay, let's check. And then I looked into it, and in 2022, it was sold and no longer calls Milwaukee home. No, it lives in Boston, at least in the winter. So I thought it was interesting. I put that ship there to kind of be a nod to my past, and it turns out it doesn't live there anymore. So after the drawing was done, digitizing it was a real chore. It was interesting. We went out and bought, let me back up. I tried to contact a bunch of people that deal in art. You know, like if the Art Institute wanted to reproduce something, a really big piece of art, they would go to a company that does this. And they told me, yeah, we could probably do it. It would cost $10,000 to reproduce, digitize. So instead of that, we bought the most recent iPhone and put together 2 chairs and a board. And I thought, okay, if I just take from the same spot, hundreds of pictures, just keep scroll, move, scroll, picture, 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 I can just stitch them together in Photoshop, easy peasy. It's not as easy as you think.
No, but it's still.
So luckily, the people at the University of Chicago Press have a great graphics guy. I did my best, but at some point, if you actually look at those boards, you can see seams, but he did a masterful job of aligning them. So the book did a much better job than I could do. But that was a fun day of documenting, and then all the weeks of trying to stitch it together afterward. After I had it digitized, I needed a physical copy that the original I could not leave the house. It's on terrible paper. If you breathe on it the wrong way, it'll tear. So I contacted a imaging company, and they took the file. It was good enough that it could actually get printed on their paper. And I remember the day when I went to the print house, nobody else was there, but it was like a room this size. And I thought, this will be easy. All I got to do is when it comes out, I just roll it up. It prints real fast. And so eventually I thought, forget it, let it go. And it went all over the place. That's like 60 feet of paper. So this these are actually the buildings that I had mentioned earlier that didn't make it into the drawing. So my map is actually a snapshot in time. In some cases, I recreated the past, but I didn't create the future. These would be the buildings that in their completed state today would make it in. And in some cases, I'm happy they didn't. And in other cases would have been nice to see. Like the Bank of America Tower. I showed it not like this, but under construction because I thought it would be more interesting. And then others like Salesforce now looks like this. And so mine was simply a crane in the ground. And so this is, it would be a living document. Had I been able to do more or have a second edition, I could make other embellishments and recreate some of the other images that you see here. It's tiny. It does make it in, but it's just a silhouette at the base of it. It's small and in the distance, but it's there. Tim Mennel, the publisher at the press, sent me this picture, which was when he was pitching it to, I guess, the board of directors at the University of Chicago Press. He sent it to me and said, here, they saw this. I brought a copy of your drawing. And I was like, oh, wow, that's great. I love it. And then when I started looking at everyone's face on the drawing, they looked somewhat disinterested. But it made, I don't know. I just think it's a funny image. I like to put it in here because it must have been unusual to see a big prop like this put on the
And
table.
looking at everything else, they're not even.
I know,
Only one person didn't look at the camera.
I'm hoping it was because it's been there for 20 minutes and they've already looked at it. But I just like the picture. So that's the majority of the process, how I came to be, where it came from, how I did it, and some of the challenges that I've come across along the way. I would like to thank, again, the Map Society, David in particular, for hosting. I'd also like to thank everybody at the University of Chicago Press for putting up with my thousands of questions and emails and things I should and shouldn't say. Especially Tim and Kristen Raditz. Kristen is the marketing person who is trying her best to wrangle me in and not go rogue and talking to a bunch of people and making things happen without her knowing about it. The Dry House Foundation gave a substantial grant for this publication, which I will be always grateful for, as well as a smaller grant from my alma mater, UWM. The Architecture Center, who heard me out at the very beginning and actually made Lynn Osmond wrote a letter saying that she would be in support of this project and sell the book in their bookshop, which turned out to be true, although she is no longer working at the CIC. And Thomas Dijja, who did the wonderful essay at the beginning of the book. Really beautiful words, and I was so grateful to have the chance to meet him at the London House rooftop a few years ago, where he interviewed me, and it was just, he's like an encyclopedia of Chicago. And I read his book, Third Coast. If you're a huge Chicago fan, you should probably check it out. And the reviewers, they each provided a blurb on the back of the book, or it's actually a leaflet that isn't necessarily printed on the back, but it's a separate page. Vladimir Belogolovsky, Jeffrey Baer, Reed Kroloff, and Juan Moreno. So I appreciate all of their kind words and everything they did to make this book a success. And I hope each of you have enjoyed hearing a little bit about it and learning what it took to make this. And I hope you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed making it. Thank you. And I also have a website, Instagram. This is actually the QR code for the book to come from the University of Chicago Press, in case anyone's interested.
If you thought of perhaps doing an individual card like some of the buildings that you would like to have.
Yes.
Work as something they could give away or promote the building.
If anybody approached me and said, hey, we're interested, I would absolutely love to do that. Yeah, in fact, there's copies of it right there. Yes.
Can you describe how you created these drawings? Did you have an easel under one arm, a chair on the other, you walk down to the river, then you have your scroll?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
It's on terrible paper. It's hard to move. It's a giant scroll. So the entire thing was drawn on my drafting table at home. I walked up and down the river, took hundreds of photos. So I had my computer the scroll and Google Earth Street View, you can place a person in the river and go up and down it. So luckily, technology aided me in everything because I wouldn't have been able to do it if I had to do it on site.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So obviously, lighting changes a lot over the course of 6 months. Did you adapt that? You know, every time you take a trip down the river, light plays a big role in Chicago's architecture. How did you adapt that in your illustrations over the course of time?
So this is a real abstraction. It's only a line drawing. So every picture I looked at was midday. Every picture I ever took was midday. And so the idea would be to try to find photos that had the least amount of shadows as possible. And actually the underside of the bridges is the most challenging because it's almost always dark. So I had to not only make it up, I didn't even know exactly what was going on because it was so hard to find. And they didn't even have river cruises at the time I was drawing it because of pandemic. And so it's a fantasy abstraction that even though it looks hyper realistic, it's actually just edges and lines and forms. It's there's no value to it like shade and shadow. And so in a way I ignored all of the light. It's just lines. So it's an interesting question because you're right. Every edge of a building is really just a difference in plane that is different reflections off of different things. And so in a way I distilled it just into lines, edges, and things like that. Yes.
So here I'm looking at building that, let's say, 127 stories, whatever. Are you drawing 127 stories? They just, that was about right.
Yes. There is not a single dimensioned anything on this drawing. It is all based on how much paper I had, except where I messed up. That's the first proportion. And then everything else is judged off of, so then if I know how big the tallest building is, I go, okay, on a trace paper, I would be able to pick it up and move it to the first part of the drawing. And then from there, okay, this is how big the bridges should be relative to that. Everything is just proportioned. And so if you actually took, let's say you knew how tall each of these buildings were and you scaled them, you'd be like, this is crazy. Your buildings are wildly out of scale because I only cared about the building next to the building I was drawing. And so over time, there could be a big disconnect between the realities between different buildings. All proportioned. That's it. Yes.
So is it ink or pencil or what?
It's ink, but I should say that I'm not some kind of savant. I don't have some magical powers in doing these things and never making a mistake. So they're called construction lines, very, very, very light pencil lines, just to get an idea that make sure, okay, this fits, this is the way I want it, this goes rough outline. And then when I'm comfortable with the scale of proportion, I go back, ink everything, and erase all the pencil. So all the evidence is gone. Yes. Sometimes, like on a very tall building, I would use a straight edge for the construction line. And then I knew I would trace that line and erase the pencil. So sometimes I would trace a straight edge line, but nothing on here is actually drawn from a direct straight edge. So if that makes sense, I'm tracing lines that could have been created from a ruler or a straight edge, but yes, 99% of it is not looking at a straight edge. It's just, you kind of understand what, okay, this looks pretty straight. Yes.
What's your favorite Chicago building?
I do not have one, but I should say that the Jewelers building is very fun to draw. And I would say that the whole area on the second board, which is London House, 333 North Michigan, and the Mather Tower, that area is probably my favorite. It's so iconic, so unusual. I got to tell you, there's a lot of great buildings on the Chicago River, but there's also a lot of bad buildings, a lot. And there were times where I was like, oh, I got to draw this thing. Yeah, Jewelers building probably comes to mind. Yes. Oof. I felt that I chewed quite a bit on this, and there have been other topics that could come up, like doing the shoreline. That would be a separate project to do it right. spending 6 months on a single drawing and then another 6 months on the same drawing is a lot. And I can't imagine spending another year or two drawing Lake Michigan. I needed a break, but it could be done. And if I didn't have a real job that I had to go through 9 to 5, I could totally do it. Yes,
Where is the original?
it's in my basement in a tube that hopefully never floods the house.
And you have the loop flood, but then Kansas Street is a little bit off your grid.
It's a little off, yeah. Yes, Lori. There are 3. Okay, no. There was never an accident. There might have been a smudge once, but I don't even remember where it happened. And there are 3 line weights. Basically, how wide the thickness of a pen is. An 0.1 millimeter, a 5, and an 8. But sometimes, so the edges of buildings, I always try to make the heaviest outline, just to make it look like it's coming off the page more. So there are 3 line weights. Any other questions? Yes. No. But my wife had so many ideas. Clouds, hot air balloons, rainbows, unicorns, everything.
You could put in a beaver, RC beavers.
And I would mess it up badly if I tried to do that. Yes.
Yeah. Or this, because it's like, you know, like, about things that I would do, things like that.
I don't think I ever actually went back. In hindsight, when I looked at the drawing, I realized that the first half of the drawing, I put way more attention on the river, like all the little lines in like dappled river waves. And so I didn't realize that until I finished. But I never went back to do it. It kind of burns you out. After a while, you're like, okay, this is pretty good. I could make it better, but do I want to? You know? Yeah.
When do you get started on all the streets?
When did I get started?
All the streets? The avenues?
Yeah.
To do the drawings for each building on each street in Chicago, in the loop?
Oh, God. Okay.
It's a joke question.
Okay, that, I mean, I thought about doing Michigan Avenue, you know,
Yeah.
from like Roosevelt all the way up to Oak Street Beach.
But the actual question is, could you do this with a street like Randolph? Or do you have to be far enough away to get a good picture so you can do the drawing?
So again, with this fantasy idea, this could never happen in a photograph because the buildings are so monumental. If you took a picture, it would then every building has a vanishing point up high. So the way I describe it is I cut the river in half and then pushed everything like half a mile away from me. And that's the only way you'd be able to see it like this with all the buildings perfectly vertical. So again, that's part of the fantasy. Yes. Yes.
I think familiar with the tiny of the Barons, children,
I have not.
German had art. I mean, I'm reminded of them, that these beautiful drawings in three-dimensional drawings of the big one in New York, and you go a lot of European cities. And tree and everything. They're amazing.
What was the name again?
Heinrich Baron, B-R-A-N.
Make a note of it.
He's down here at the meeting.
Oh. I have some friends in the audience, they're taking notes. I do want to find out who this is. I love seeing, people that have done similar work to this. It's fascinating to me to see. I've actually been using watercolor lately, but not on large scale stuff. I go out once a week with my colleagues. I went just yesterday, last week, and I'm trying to get more comfortable with color. I've never been comfortable with it, but I know it can be a powerful tool, and trying.
That would be a challenge because the time of day, a lot of the windows would be gold from the setting sun.
I wouldn't even think
Some of
about,
the windows are tinted green.
Oh my-
They would also,
I would have to be such a pro and confident. I can't imagine, oh, I'm gonna start, first of all, it would have to be on high quality paper,
they would be different colors at
And-
different times of day.
or I could fudge it and eventually just make it look all like it was the same time of day.
In your work as an architect, I imagine you would really think to render.
Not on the computer, though. As long as it's by hand, then yes, which nobody does.
Did you learn architecture when it in the computer age or?
In- Interesting, when I started architecture school, almost no computer, like late nineties. By the time I got to my final semester, I was the only one drawing by hand. Everybody else was drawing on computer. Yes.
You were to. Kind of stuff like how you might be compared to. Like added your own kind of skill to it, like
Mm.
where. There's also, but also timeline of the drawing.
Yeah.
That you set as, like, the day of your life. But that also, like, I guess what I mean is that it's interesting you talk about it because there are all sorts of these personal, like, where it is, like, your life that confidence that you're, as like, you personalize and you let them what that is.
Mhm.
There's also like all the, you know, who design, who can build it, like that, only an architect is gonna see or like know that like, oh yeah, this is. There was something like here's the architect. I guess how you think about like what, how much you want is also documented in your life.
Mm.
Which is like the abstract of the city. Apart from.
There's a lot of stories in my own personal life, the things I went through in this drawing, but at the end of the day, I had to keep a language consistent throughout. So I couldn't bring any of my own, aside from those two anomalies of things that aren't actually there. Things happened in my life throughout those 2 years and stories of the city itself. Like that one building that I worked on, I worked in it for years and years and years. And yet here on this drawing, it's just a handful of lines. And people probably don't realize how much time we spend designing each one of these. And so much goes into them, but most people just walk right by. Well, there's a lot of stories, but not a lot that I can draw to make it, give it justice. Yeah.
In the beginning, when I was making maps with ink, before the computer came, it happens, you know. And so I appreciate that it's done by hand, and it's an art. And thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you very much
this.
for
I
having me.
think everybody's very pleased.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for coming.
One of my favorite times along the river is winter.
Ah,
When it's frozen, you have all these different geometric shapes of the ice.
yeah. Yeah, it has to get real cold.
Then you'd have to be looking down to see the ice,
Yeah.
otherwise it would all be flat.
Right.
That's gonna happen someday.